Alright guys, I promised you a review video for this unit. This unit is Imperialism and it was only 3 days, so don't expect a really large test. Somewhere between 30 and 45 questions. This review video will cover the map skills that you need to know for the test, like the areas that you need to locate. It will also cover the why, how, and results of imperialism. That was the first day. Then we'll talk about imperialism in Africa, Asia, and India, the motivations behind those three areas, who went where and why. And then we'll end it up with imperialism in the Pacific Islands and Australia, which is what we went over today. And then we'll also talk about the brushback of imperialism. So your test will be this Wednesday, February the 8th, in class, and then expect a small alternative assessment. And then after the test, we'll do a brief overview of absolutism. That was one of the objectives that y'all didn't do well on the Europe test. So the review video is coming up. So we're going over imperialism, like I said before. This is a review of all of the content within the 3-day unit. I'm going to try to make this as brief. This is your calendar. It shows you the course sequence that we went over for imperialism and what we'll be talking about. So we'll start off with map skills. On your study guide, it asks you to locate a few areas. You need to know where China is. I feel like most of you are confident in locating China. China is in Asia, and it borders the Pacific Ocean. Australia. Australia is the continent at the bottom of your world map, and it will border the Indian and Pacific Ocean. India, the only way I could tell you to find it is find the jut out in the middle of the Asian continent. That is India. Remember, we studied southern India, Mughal India earlier in the year. The continent of Africa, you need to know where it is located. The Mediterranean Sea, we've been talking about that since the beginning of the course. The Mediterranean Sea is between Africa and Europe. And then it also asks you to locate the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. So if you look in the bottom left corner of the screen, you'll see that I have an insert. So this is the Mediterranean Sea correlated with the Mediterranean Sea on the world map. And you'll see that you have Egypt and Cairo, which would be about here on your world map. And then you have the Red Sea, and there is a jut out kind of on this map where you can see it. It is the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is important because it connects the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea and on out into Europe. So sailors no longer have to go around Africa and make that long, treacherous journey anymore. They can come up and go through the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, and connect with the Mediterranean Sea and go to Europe. Remember this political cartoon, it might show up on your test. It covers mercantilism. We discussed the symbolism in class. You have the mother country. Remember the alliteration. Mercantilism is making money for the mother country. So you have the colonies that are there to serve the mother country. Mercantilism is a cause of or a why for imperialism. All right. The definition of imperialism is the scramble for overseas territory. We spoke of European domination, even though the United States also engaged in imperialism, and it all boils down to empire building. Why did the Europeans engage in imperialism? Number one, they need resources. Remember, we just spoke of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution makes the need for raw materials that cannot be found on the European continent. In addition to resources, they also need markets or places to sell their goods. Once the Europeans make colonies, spheres of influence, and protectorates out of the various regions that we spoke to, they will then sell their goods to people in these areas. Religion also plays a big part. Remember that the Europeans are Christian and they want to spread the gospel to areas that are not necessarily Christian. So, Islamic areas, Buddhist areas, Shinto areas, and other religions that we spoke about earlier in the year, they want to make them Christian. Mercantilism, making money for the mother country. The goal of mercantilism is for the mother country to become self sufficient. So, for these countries to become self sufficient, they gather colonies so that they have places to get raw materials, places to sell their goods to, and all of the other spoils that come with colonies. A, la- Again, competition between Europeans. We just spoke about the Congress of Vienna and how Europeans are fighting for power in this balance of power. This plays out in imperialism, and the conflict spills over into a grab for land by the Europeans. How are the Europeans engaging in imperialism? Number one, they take on colonies. Remember the textbook example that I gave you in class. In a colony, total control is um, by the mother country. So they take total control over an area. The controlled nations do not rule themselves. The example is in India with the British India Company. Great Britain completely ruled India. They sent in their own rulers after, especially after the Sepoy Rebellion, and they controlled India, who they could trade to, their rules, their laws, so on and so forth. Protectorates. With a protectorate, the nation actually rules itself, but it depends on the mother country for protection. In return for resources and control over certain areas. So, in a protectorate, the home nation does have some control over what's going on, but in exchange for protection, they agree to give up some of their resources or even some of their areas to get that protection from the mother country. An example of that would be the Suez Canal that we spoke about. Um, Egyptians agreed to give access to the Suez Canal to the British in exchange for their protection. Lastly, you have spheres of influence. Spheres of influence control themselves. However, Europeans do get access to certain areas within the country. They actually get exclusive trade rights in certain areas, and the only place we talked about with spheres of influence is China. Results of imperialism. So, number one, nations are controlled and dominated politically, economically, and militarily. They do not have control over their own government. They do not have control over who they can buy from, who they can sell to. That's economics. And militarily, they are often protected or guarded over by the mother country. Controlled nations are forced to trade however Europeans want, even if it is not to the advantage of the colony. Industrially produced goods take over traditional goods. So remember, we talked about cottage industries where you make things by hand. That is going to go away. And the goods that are made in Great Britain, France, Germany, wherever the mother country is, they are going to dominate the markets in these smaller areas. Control will lead to a rise in nationalism in colonized areas, which will eventually lead to some pushback in these colonies against the Europeans. And lastly, colonized people resist European and Western domination in different and sometimes violent ways. It's just a review. You can look at this slide. I showed it to you today in class of the forms of imperialism. I went over them a few seconds ago in this video. Scramble for Africa. The first place we talked about was Africa, and remember the scramble for Africa is after King Leopold II opens up Congo for trade. The Victoria Falls are found. We no longer are on the coast of Africa. We actually can come into the interior of the continent. In the 1880s, the Europeans began to divide up the continent into colonies. The Berlin Conference, which will not be on your test, African countries did not attend, but this is how Europeans strategically mapped out Africa. The only two countries that remained independent after the scramble for Africa are Liberia and Ethiopia. Impacts of imperialization on Africa, number one, you have positive impacts, whether you have reduced local warfare, improved sanitation, the lifespan of Africans increased, the literacy rates increased because they're allowed to go back to Europe to become educated. So there are positive impacts. The negative impacts, you have a loss of land and independence, a breakdown of traditional culture, and division of the continent. So these people are not allowed to rule themselves and dictate what it is that they want to do as they've been doing for hundreds of years, as we spoke about in class. The next place we talked about was India. India was controlled by the British East India Company. Um, Britons looked to India for raw materials and markets to sell their goods. Negative impacts of imperialism in India. India was no longer self sufficient. They could not rule themselves. Remember, we spoke of the Mughal Empire and the Southern Indian Empire, which were very powerful at the beginning of the class. Cash crops are being planted, so farmers can no longer plant crops that actually feed their families, and it leads to famine. Indian companies, the cottage system, they go out of business because Great Britain dominates their markets, and there is a loss of traditional Indian culture, including religion, way of life type of things. Positive impacts on India. India is industrialized, meaning that they move to factories, urbanization, those types of things. Education increases. Indians are allowed to go back to Britain to educate themselves. They have a Western type education that comes in, and sanitation. Thing that you need to know about India is the Sepoy Rebellion. Remember, we spoke that Great Britain had no regard for the Indians' religious beliefs, so to speak, and they greased the bullets and rifle cartridges with beef and pork fat, which was a violation of Muslim and Hindu diets. As a result, the sepoys, the soldiers of the East India Company, rebelled. This rebellion was put down by Great Britain. As a result, India no longer has a say so in their governing at all. There are no sepoys anymore. India becomes a colony of Great Britain, and new taxes are input on India, and nationalism or pride in the people grows in India. So we have a creation of things like the Indian National Congress, and the Muslim League. The last place that we spoke about was Australia and the Pacific Ocean, and we spoke of that in class today. Australia is a continent. You do need to know where it is. It borders the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In Australia, like several other places that we spoke about in class, had people who were there before the Europeans come. They had been inhabited by a group of people called the Aborigines. When Europeans come, mainly the British, the Aborigines suffer greatly. They die from famine, harsh conditions, diseases, those types of things. In 1788, Great Britain makes Australia into what is called a penal colony. You need to know that definition. A penal colony is a settlement used to exile prisoners and separate them from the general population in a remote location. So, people who were convicted of crimes in Great Britain would be shipped off to Australia, and they would be forced to live and work there. Australia was a colony. Australia provides Britain with, excuse me, Australia provides Great Britain with markets, fueling stations, and land and resources that they do not otherwise have in Great Britain. The last place we spoke about was the Pacific Ocean. Industrial powers take interest in the small islands in the Pacific. So imperialism in this region is dominated by the United States and some countries in Europe, but mainly the United States. The islands in the Pacific are good for commercial outposts. The imperialist powers want to control the islands on the way to Asia for refueling and supplies. So We need a place to stop on our way to China, on our way to India, on our way to these places to refuel our ships. And we also need new markets to send our goods to. And we also need supplies for our sailors and whalers as they are on their way to the Asian main continent. And lastly, colonial powers want to control trade and production of raw materials on the island. And so we spoke of in class specific places like Samoa, the Philippines, Hawaii, Virgin Islands, those type of things, even Cuba in the Western Hemisphere, they are controlled by imperialist powers. Last thing that you need to know for your test is the emergence of a pushback against the imperialist movement. So, nationalism occurs. Nationalism is an intense pride in one's people or country. So, the educated class within these countries begin to push back against the imperialist powers. Um, you have an introduction of Western ideas of citizenship and representative government, which is in direct contrast with imperialism. You have a new elite class of merchants, educated peoples that work for the government or who have been educated on the European continent and know the ins and outs of government and what should be going on. And then you also have traditional resistance movements, peasant revolts, religious resentment. We talked about the Sepoy Rebellion in India. You also need to know the Boxer Rebellion, which happened in China, which was a rebellion against the Europeans in China and the foreign influence that was going on. Chinese nationalists, people who want Chinese to be free of, or who want China to be free of European rule, launch a rebellion in Peking, um, and they resist against European rule. The Boxer Rebellion does not, uh, it's not successful. They do get a large group of people. They burn cities. They destroy railway lines, and people organize to crush the rebellion that is going on. They basically begin to starve the people. And other ways to put down the rebellion, but you need to know that the Boxer Rebellion is a pushback on imperialist control. So that is the end of the review video. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or contact me via Remind. Your test is next Wednesday, the next day in class. You do need to do your flashcards and your study guide. That is homework for this class, and that will be due before the test.